Hey guys, tonight we begin with something deceptively elegant, a Victorian wedding, the kind everyone imagines as lace, candlelight, and romance. But as you step into the scene, moving through the soft rustle of silk skirts and the heavy scent of orange blossom, you start realizing this isn't a celebration of love, it's a transaction, a negotiation, a polite, pastel-colored trap. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of a Victorian church, stiff collar scratching your neck, watching a bride glide down the aisle. Everyone whispers about her beauty, the required currency of womanhood, but no one whispers about her rights, because she doesn't really have any. Her father is giving her away, which is charming, until you remember that phrase was literal. To give meant to transfer. And you, standing here as a Victorian woman about to be married, are about to become property with a veil. The organ hums. Guests dab their eyes. You wonder if anyone realizes the bride probably hasn't chosen this dress, this groom, or this future. Even her wedding ring isn't for romance. It's a symbol of ownership, a tradition dating back to Roman law. Historians still argue whether Victorian society genuinely believed marriage was sacred, or whether it was simply the most efficient way to manage women, children, and property. Either way, you're about to find out firsthand. You walk toward the altar, each step echoing with the knowledge that your future has already been negotiated behind closed doors over tea and biscuits. A mainstream fact here: Victorian engagement wasn't just two people promising to love each other. It was a formal contract between families. Breaking it could lead to court cases, public humiliation, and newspapers eagerly roasting your reputation like a Sunday roast. You weren't in love, you were entering a legal partnership, one tightly wrapped in lace. Your hands tremble slightly as the vows begin. For richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, all the romantic wording that sounds sweet, until you notice the missing piece. The groom promises to love, cherish, and protect. You promise to obey, not respect, not support, obey, just in case the power imbalance wasn't clear enough. Even the church kneeler feels uneven, like it's warning you. Balance is not what Victorian marriage was designed for. As you look up, the groom smiles, completely confident. Why wouldn't he be? He's walking into a world where the law favors him every step of the way. You, on the other hand, are about to disappear legally under the doctrine of coverture, but that revelation belongs to a later section. For now, you're still standing at the altar, trying to steady your breath, wondering whether anyone else feels the walls closing in. The priest drones on, voice echoing through stained glass reflections. Light dances across your dress, but it's cold comfort. This ceremony feels less like a celebration and more like a beautifully choreographed transfer of power. Somewhere in the back of the church, someone coughs. You wonder if they're the only one hearing the wedding march as a warning siren. Then comes the kiss, awkward, formal, witnessed by everyone. It's less true love's moment and more contract signed. When he takes your hand afterward, you feel the weight of your new life settling into your bones. A quirky little detail Victorian brides knew all too well. Many fainted at the altar, not from overwhelming emotion, but from tight corsets, skipped meals, and sheer anxiety. Fainting became so common that fainting couches were a fashionable household staple, as if Victorian homes were designed by women who were emotionally done with everything. The reception follows, full of polite laughter, clinking teacups, and guests commenting on the perfect match. You smile because that's your job. Victorian wives were expected to be the pleasant background music of their husbands' lives, nothing too loud, nothing too noticeable. Meanwhile, every bite of cake tastes like future disappointment, and trust me, Victorian wedding cake was dense enough to double as a doorstop. You sit beside your new husband as relatives toast him, always him, for securing such a lovely bride. No one congratulates you for anything beyond existing attractively enough to be chosen. Another historian debate floats into your mind. Some argue Victorian women felt genuinely proud to be married, seeing it as the only respectable path to adulthood. Others argue they simply adapted to the narrow options society gave them. Either way, you smile through the speeches, because the alternative would cause whispers. As the evening fades, you notice something else. People stop addressing you by your own name. They call you Mrs. Husband's name, a title that signals your absorption into his life. Your identity is no longer individual, it's curated to complement his. In this era, marriage doesn't elevate you, it relocates you. You slip into the carriage, wedding dress rustling like a warning. The streets blur past, gas lamps glowing in the fog, and reality begins to settle in. You're not going home, you're going to his home. His rules, his world. The sensation is eerie, like walking through a doorway that shuts and bolts itself behind you. Inside the house, you're greeted by his servants, not yours. They measure you with quick, curious glances, polite smiles hiding quiet judgment. The maids already know more about your daily future than you do. They've seen brides arrive with hope and leave with hollow eyes. They've watched marriages crumble behind wallpaper and candlelight. If walls could gossip, Victorian ones would never sleep. Tonight, though, you're still wrapped in ceremony, still floating in the afterglow of social approval. You hang up your gloves, your veil, your last pieces of girlhood. The house creaks softly, as if making room for you. You sit on the edge of the bed, listening to the distant tick of a clock, mechanical, precise, indifferent. The perfect soundtrack for a marriage built on expectation rather than choice. You take a deep breath. This is only the beginning. Victorian marriage isn't gentle. It isn't fair. And as you lie back, staring at a ceiling too ornate for comfort, you can feel the edges of your old life slipping away. You wake the next morning to a house that feels too quiet, too polished, and far too large for comfort. Victorian mornings aren't gentle. They're stiff, scripted, and full of unspoken rules that you're expected to know instinctively even though no one bothered to teach you. You stretch, feeling the weight of your new wedding ring, and the realization hits you. Today, you step into courtship's final form, and into a lifetime of social suffocation disguised as elegance. You pull on your dress, which somehow feels tighter after one night of marriage, probably because Victorian fashion believed breathing was optional, and make your way downstairs. The hallways echo with the soft footsteps of servants who have been awake for hours. Everyone already knows their part in this household play. Except you. Courtship, after all, wasn't meant to prepare you for real marriage. It was meant to prepare you to behave. You remember those courtship years vividly, all the stiff afternoon visits, the tea so weak it tasted like regret, and the feeling that every word you spoke got weighed like produce at a market stall. Victorian etiquette books said a lady must not laugh too loudly, speak too boldly, write too often, or think too much. Basically, you were expected to be charming wallpaper, decorative, silent, and non-threatening. As you sit in the morning parlour, sunlight trickling through lace curtains, you recall one mainstream Victorian fact that still makes your eyelid twitch. During courtship, you were not allowed to be alone with your suitor. Not once. Not even for a moment. A chaperone hovered like a judgmental cloud, a mother, an aunt, or that one cousin who lived for gossip and biscuits. Historians still argue whether this was genuinely about protecting your virtue or just controlling your life from cradle to altar. A tiny snort escapes your nose thinking about it. Protect your virtue? More like protect your market value. Your husband enters the room with a polite nod, as if you're two co-workers forced to share an office. You've known him for months, maybe even a year, but only through filtered, stiff encounters that never revealed who he actually is. Courtship wasn't designed for intimacy, it was designed for display. Like two fancy birds trying not to embarrass themselves in front of their parents. He takes his seat, and you sip your tea, pretending you don't notice, his eyes skimming the newspaper more than they skim you. This, you realize, is the real Victorian marriage rhythm. Quiet companionship, punctuated by louder expectations. Your mind drifts back to the suffocating rules you had to follow before this moment. A quirky Victorian tidbit floats in. Lovers often communicated using elaborate fan signals. Yes, fans. Because apparently having a conversation like a normal person was too scandalous. Tilt the fan equals flirting. Snap it shut equals anger. Cover half your face equals mystery. Drop it equals marriage proposal. Basically, Victorian dating was like living inside a slow-motion Morse code. You stare at your hands now, thinking how absurd it was that your entire romantic future could hinge on the angle at which you held a folding piece of fabric. But that was Victorian courtship, heavily coded, painfully polite, and more stressful than it ever needed to be. A servant appears with letters on a silver tray. One of them is addressed to you from your mother. Her handwriting wobbles with excitement, or fear, or both. As you read, you can practically hear her voice saying things like, "Remember to be agreeable," and "A happy marriage begins with a happy wife, but a happy wife begins with obedience." Classic Victorian motherly wisdom, emotionally supportive, with a sprinkle of control. You set the letter down and notice your husband watching you now, brows slightly raised, not in curiosity, in assessment. That was another part of courtship they didn't put in the pamphlets. Even after marriage, you're being evaluated, not for your charm anymore, but for your competence. How well you run the household, how gracefully you handle expectations, how calmly you fold yourself into the creases of his life. The conversation that follows is polite but shallow. You talk about the weather. Victorians loved weather, perhaps because it was the only safe topic that didn't send anyone into moral panic. And he mentions business matters in vague terms. Not because he wants to include you, but because mentioning business makes him feel important. Victorian men were good at that. But then, unexpectedly, he sets the newspaper aside and asks whether you'd like to take a walk in the garden later. A small gesture, simple, almost sweet. And yet you know the truth behind it. These morning strolls are observed, not officially, but informally. Servants watch, neighbours peek. Every gesture becomes community property. Victorian society devoured gossip like candy, and young married couples were their favourite flavour. You nod politely, agreeing to the walk, but inside your mind, you're replaying the suffocating rituals you endured while getting to know him before marriage. Things like calling cards, those stiff little papers you left at people's homes to announce you existed, as if you were a very polite ghost. Or the bizarre rule that you should never, under any circumstances, speak to a suitor first. Women initiating conversations was considered bold, and boldness was a moral failing. Which is ironic, because the men who wrote these rules were experts at moral failing. A draft rustles the curtains as you sip your tea again. Victorian homes were always cold, even the expensive ones. You blow into your cup, warming your hands, and realize something quietly heartbreaking. Courtship had been the most freedom you'd ever had. And it wasn't freedom at all. It was curated performance. But at least it had structure. Marriage is where the mask drops. Your husband excuses himself for his morning appointments, and you're left sitting in that elegant room, surrounded by floral wallpaper and freezing air, wondering what comes next. Courtship taught you how to be desirable. It did not teach you how to be married. You run your finger along the lace tablecloth, the one chosen by either his mother or a servant, definitely not by him. Victorian men didn't know a tablecloth from a handkerchief unless someone told them. You wonder how many mismatched expectations this marriage already contains. Historians still debate whether Victorian couples were truly affectionate behind closed doors or simply performed affection in public and tolerated each other privately. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, a wide spectrum from genuine fondness to full emotional exile. Your chest tightens a little at the thought. Victorian courtship didn't allow you to know his flaws. It also didn't allow him to know yours. Now you're two strangers legally bound, standing at the threshold of the rest of your life, hoping that whatever compatibility you didn't get to explore won't come back to haunt you. As the clock ticks gently on the mantelpiece, You realize the cruel irony. Courtship gave you rules for how to meet your husband, but none for how to survive him. You take a slow breath, smoothing your skirt. This is marriage now, and Victorian marriage only gets more complicated from here. You spend the rest of the morning wandering through your new home, fingertips brushing over polished banisters and stiff floral wallpapers, trying to memorize hallways that all look like they were designed by someone terrified of color. Victorian houses weren't just homes, they were statements of class, made to impress visitors and quietly intimidate the people living inside them. As you step into the dining room, still faintly smelling of last night's wedding feast, you're struck by one uncomfortable truth. The biggest decisions about your future have already been made, and none of them were made by you. Welcome to the world of dowries, deals, and silent bargains. Victorian marriage wasn't built on romance. It was built on economics, a delicate tango of money, property, alliances, and family reputation. You didn't marry a man. You married his income, his prospects, his lineage, and occasionally his mother's very strong opinions. In this era, love was optional. Advantage was mandatory. You stepped closer to the table where the marriage agreement had been reviewed just days before. It wasn't signed by you, of course. Why would it be? Victorian women didn't need to understand financial arrangements, or so society insisted. Money matters were handled by fathers and husbands, the two men who essentially traded custody of you like fine china. The mainstream fact hits you again. Victorian dowries weren't symbolic. They were literal payments a bride's family made to secure a suitable match. Sometimes the dowry could buy the groom a small estate, fund renovations, settle his debts, or pay for that horse he definitely didn't need. Other times, the dowry simply acted as reassurance that the bride brought something valuable into the marriage besides her uterus. You run your palm along the back of a carved wooden chair, thinking how strange it is that your worth could be tallied, negotiated, and itemized like livestock. A quirky historical detail slips into your memory. In some rare cases, when a bride lacked a dowry, families offered furniture, silverware, or even cows as substitutes. Congratulations, you think, imagining yourself standing beside a cow at the negotiation table. A husband for you, and a barn buddy to sweeten the deal. But beneath the polished surface of all these transactions lies something no one ever talks about. Fear. The fear of marrying beneath your class. The fear of remaining unmarried. The fear of becoming a burden on your family. Victorian society treated a single woman over 25 like a ticking bomb, except instead of exploding, she simply became an object of pity. You walk into the drawing room, sunlight catching dust motes that dance in slow spirals. This room likely hosted the formal meeting between your family and his, a polite battle of wills disguised as tea. Historians still argue whether Victorian families genuinely believed these negotiations created stability, or whether they were simply clinging to tradition because letting people choose their own partners felt dangerously modern. You imagine your father sitting stiffly in a high-backed chair, posture straight as a fence post, discussing annuities and property transfers with your future father-in-law. He probably avoided directly mentioning your dowry too gauche, but he would have gently hinted at it, as Victorian men did when pretending not to talk about money. Meanwhile, you would have been seated quietly nearby, smiling at the correct moments, hands folded, shoulders relaxed, pretending you weren't listening, even though your entire future hung on every word like a fragile ornament. You remember the tension in your mother's face as she adjusted your gloves before the meeting. She was proud, of course. Securing a good match was practically a sport for Victorian mothers, but she was also nervous. A poorly handled negotiation could reduce your value instantly. A misinterpreted remark, a dress slightly outdated, even a laugh too loud could shift opinions. Your husband, for his part, had his own stakes in this arrangement. Victorians may have worshipped the idea of respectable masculinity, but many men desperately needed a wealthy bride to maintain their lifestyle. A crumbling estate, a string of old debts, a younger brother running wild in London's gambling halls. A bride with a strong dowry could fix all of that in minutes. You weren't just a wife, you were a financial strategy. You sit at the edge of the couch, smoothing the folds of your dress that insist on wrinkling no matter how still you sit. Everything about this marriage feels like a carefully staged play, everyone performing their roles seamlessly, except you, who is still trying to find your lines. A soft knock interrupts your thoughts. A maid enters, holding a small ledger. She explains it's the household account book, not for you to manage. Of course, you're simply expected to approve occasional decisions, look gracious, and not faint when numbers are mentioned. But you're curious, so you flip through the neat columns of ink, bills for coal, tea, fabric, repairs, servants' wages, and then you see it, a line item for marriage settlement, your dowry. Seeing it recorded so plainly makes your stomach tighten. It's not that you didn't know it existed, but seeing it listed like a household expense, sandwiched between linen purchases and carriage maintenance punctures, the romantic delusion. Victorian society encourages young brides to nurture. The maid hesitates, as if she might say something, then simply curtsies and leaves. She knows the same secret every servant in this house knows. Marriages here are not built on affection. They are built on accounting. You close the ledger gently, feeling a strange mix of sadness and clarity. Maybe this is why Victorian novels are full of heroines trying to escape bad marriages. Because even fictional women recognize the trap. You walk toward the window, watching carriages rattle down the street. Somewhere in one of those houses sits another new bride, trying to understand her place in a marriage that was arranged to preserve wealth, status, and reputation. Everything except personal happiness. A thought creeps into your mind like an unwelcome draft. Without a dowry, you would not be here. Without a dowry, you might still be home, unmarried, earning pitying looks from your neighbors. Without a dowry, you might have had fewer choices, or maybe, in a strange way, more. Historians still debate whether Victorian women accepted these conditions willingly or simply conformed because rebellion cost too much. It's probably both. You can already feel how heavy expectations are, how tightly they wrap around your ribs like a corset pulled one notch too far. You breathe in slowly, watching your breath fog slightly in the cold room. Victorian homes are elegant, but they're also cold in temperature, and sometimes in spirit. You rest your hand against the glass. Dowries open doors, they also close them. Marriage wasn't an escape from your old life. It was an exchange, one where you were the most valuable item on the table, and no one ever lets you forget it. You close the ledger slowly, the numbers still echoing in your mind as you leave the drawing room behind. The farther you walk down the hallway, the more the house feels like it's watching you. Tall ceilings, heavy drapes, and the faint perfume of last night's guests lingering in the air like a reminder that your life now belongs to another world. A world that expects things from you, demands things from you, and tonight it expects the one ritual Victorians almost never spoke openly about, even though everyone knew it was coming: your wedding night. You try not to think about it too much as you move through the quiet corridors, but it's there, pulsing under your ribs like a second heartbeat. Victorian society behaved as though marital intimacy didn't exist. Young women were taught nothing about it deliberately, because innocence wasn't just a virtue, it was a tool used to control you. You step into your new bedroom, and the sight makes your stomach swirl. The room looks like a magazine spread, if magazines existed, which they don't yet, with lace, candles, and impossibly crisp linens. The fire pops softly in the grate, throwing warm light across the four-poster bed. The bed that suddenly feels less like a piece of furniture and more like a looming appointment. Victorian wedding nights were wrapped in fear, superstition, and wildly inaccurate science. Your mother might have given you vague advice about being agreeable. Maybe she handed you a scented sachet and whispered, "It won't be so bad," without making eye contact. Historians still argue whether Victorian mothers genuinely didn't know how to explain these things, or whether society simply forbade such conversations with military-grade strictness. A mainstream fact hits you. Many Victorian brides learned what a wedding night involved only when it happened. No diagrams, no health class, just terror, pressure, and a husband who was probably just as nervous, though far better informed. You sit on the edge of the bed, fingers gripping the embroidered coverlet. Victorian women weren't taught pleasure. They were taught duty. You were told that a good wife submitted gracefully, like a character in a moral novel, something about protecting your purity while also instantly producing children. The logic made no sense, but the pressure was profound. Your breath wavers. In the wardrobe hangs your nightdress, delicate cotton, trimmed with lace, the height of Victorian innocence. But innocence is exactly the problem. You feel like a character in a scene you didn't get to rehearse. A quirky detail floats into your memory. Victorian physicians genuinely believed women who enjoyed intimacy were disordered, hysteria, moral collapse, weakening nerves, take your pick. So you weren't just expected to be silent, you were expected to be emotionally absent for your own protection, as if your body were a room someone else rented temporarily. You rise and walk toward the washstand, dipping your fingertips into the cool water. The porcelain pitcher clinks gently, a tiny sound in a giant, expectant room. You study your reflection in the rippled glass mirror. Your cheeks look pale, your hair still pinned with pearl combs. You look like a bride in a painting, soft, fragile, timeless, but definitely not prepared. Behind you, the door creaks open slightly. A servant pokes her head in the same maid who brought you the ledger. She carries a small bottle. "Tonic, miss," she whispers. "For nerves. It's common after a wedding." Common. That word stings. How many brides before you needed something to steady their hands? How many felt the same tremor of dread? You take the bottle, nodding in silent gratitude. The maid doesn't linger. She closes the door gently, as if she understands too well what kind of night lies ahead. You turn back to the room, suddenly feeling like the walls are inching closer. Victorian men, for all their bluster, weren't always experts either. Courtship rules kept couples so separated that many husbands walked into their wedding night with confidence that was far greater than their skill. Some were gentle, some were impatient, some were drunk liquid courage in a society terrified of honest intimacy. Historians still debate how common tenderness was. Diaries give glimpses. Some women recount sweet, tentative first nights. Others describe confusion, fear, even pain. And some don't write at all, which says more than any diary ever could. You hear footsteps in the hallway. Your heart leaps. He's coming. You stand, smoothing your dress even though it doesn't need smoothing. Your palms feel damp. Your breath catches. You suddenly wish courtship had allowed you to know this man better, to speak to him alone, to ask questions without a chaperone hovering like a moral fog. You wish someone had told you what to expect. The footsteps pause outside the door. A soft knock. He's being polite or nervous or both. "May I come in?" he asks. His voice is steady, but there's something cautious in it. You realize with a strange flicker of relief that he's uneasy too. Victorian masculinity demanded confidence, but wedding nights demanded vulnerability. Two strangers expected to perform intimacy because society said it was time. You inhale and answer, yes. He steps inside, closing the door behind him. His coat is gone, his tie loosened. He looks almost human now, less like the polished gentleman from the wedding, and more like a man just trying to find his footing in the quiet of the night. He approaches slowly, giving you space. Thank God for that. Not every Victorian husband bothered. "I know this is new," he says softly, surprising you. "For both of us." The tension in your shoulders loosens slightly, but the room still feels charged, like a musical note held too long. You both sit on the edge of the bed, far enough apart to maintain decorum, close enough to acknowledge the expectation hovering over you. The silence stretches, filled with the crackle of the fire and the soft tick of the clock. Victorian homes always had clocks, constant reminders of time passing, duties approaching, expectations creeping closer, second by second. You look down at your hands, trying to steady your breathing. He notices. If you're nervous, he offers gently, we don't have to rush. You blink, surprised again. Not all husbands were this patient. Some believed the first night was an obligation, not a conversation. A quiver of relief moves through your chest. Maybe this won't be as terrifying as you feared. Maybe he's as unsure about this strange, scripted tradition as you are. The fire pops again. You feel its warmth against your back. You glance up at him. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, you admit quietly. His expression softens. Neither do I, honestly. And for the first time, you feel like two people in the same room instead of two roles trapped in the same ritual. Still, the weight of the night remains. You know the expectation hasn't vanished. It's only softened, deferred. But in a society that taught you nothing and demanded everything, even a moment of compassion feels like rebellion. You shift closer, not because tradition demands it, but because maybe you choose it. Just a little. A tiny step into an enormous unknown. Victorian marriage may be brutal, but tonight, at least, you face it with gentleness instead of fear. For now, morning light spills across the bedroom floor, soft and golden, as if trying to convince you that everything feels normal, safe, familiar. But nothing about this morning is familiar. Not the bed you're lying in, not the house around you, and least of all, the legal reality that has quietly wrapped itself around your life overnight, like ivy creeping up an old stone wall. You sit up slowly, fingers pressing into the embroidered coverlet, and take a deep breath. Victorian air is always a little too cold in the mornings, no matter how big the house is or how many fireplaces it contains. The warmth from last night's fire has disappeared, leaving behind only that crisp, chilly sensation that Victorian writers like to call fresh, a poetic way to say uncomfortably freezing. Your husband has already risen. Of course he has. Victorian men were trained to move through life like clockwork, while women were expected to drift delicately behind them, as if incapable of generating momentum on their own. You hear distant footsteps, servants moving quietly through the hall. More than anything, you hear the sound of a door closing downstairs, the heavy, solid sound of a man leaving for his day with complete freedom. And you rise into a life where your freedom has evaporated. Welcome to the brutal legal reality of Victorian marriage, coverture. You wrap your shawl around your shoulders and move toward the window, looking out at the quiet street below. Carriages pass occasionally, wheels clattering against cobblestone, and the morning mist curls over the rooftops like a ghost deciding which chimney to haunt. But the real haunting is happening inside you, the realization that you are no longer a legal individual. A mainstream fact thuds into your mind. Under coverture, a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. Absorbed is the polite word. Erased is the accurate one. You cannot own property. You cannot sign contracts. You cannot keep your wages, not that you're allowed to earn any. You cannot sue anyone. You cannot even keep your own children if he decides otherwise. Victorian law basically says, congratulations on your wedding, you no longer exist. You pull back from the window, your reflection ghostly in the glass. You remember your mother's words, marriage is a woman's true security. But standing here now, it feels more like a velvet-lined cage. Your husband's freedom echoes through the house again, distant but unmistakable. He can walk out the door, do business, earn money, ride horses, laugh loudly in public, and make decisions that shape the rest of your shared life. You, on the other hand, cannot even purchase a loaf of bread on credit without his approval. Historians still debate whether most Victorian men genuinely believed this was fair or simply accepted the system because it benefited them so greatly. Possibly both. You leave the bedroom, the hallway swallowing the sound of your footsteps. Victorian hallways are good at that swallowing sound, swallowing secrets. The wallpaper feels stiff, the air slightly musty, and the silence impossibly heavy for a house full of people. Servants glide past like shadows, offering polite bows but no conversation. They know their place. You're still figuring out yours. As you descend the stairs, another unsettling fact sits at the back of your mind. Legally, even your body no longer belongs to you. Victorian marriage laws allowed husbands to demand intimacy whenever they wished. The concept of marital consent was non-existent. Many women simply endured. Others negotiated silently. A few resisted, but resistance carried danger. You step into the morning room, where a tray of tea and toast sits waiting. A maid curtsies and sets it down with practiced grace. "Your breakfast, ma'am," she says softly. The title, ma'am, still feels foreign, like a coat that doesn't quite fit yet. She leaves quietly, and you're alone again. Alone, yet never truly alone. As you butter your toast, you remember something deeply ironic. Unmarried Victorian women had more rights than married ones. Single women, widows, spinsters, even governesses could own property, earn money, sign leases, and make decisions. They had social limitations, of course, but legally, they existed. In contrast, marriage reduced a woman's status to that of a permanent minor. A quirky historical tidbit floats in. In some legal documents, Victorian married women were actually listed next to children and lunatics. You nearly choke on your toast thinking about it. Lovely. Nothing boosts confidence like being classified with toddlers and the clinically unstable. You sip your tea, letting its warmth fight the cold knot in your stomach. A servant enters timidly. "Ma'am," the master requested, "you look over the household accounts today." Requested. That's what they call it. You nod with a polite smile. Even though this isn't a request at all, it's your new duty. A wife was expected to manage the home like a small corporation, except with zero authority and no salary. You are the CEO of dusting, budgeting, meal planning, and political silence. You walk with the servant to the study his study and take a seat at a delicate writing desk. The accounts ledger lies open, ink still glistening on the last entry. Coal delivery, carpet cleaning, repairs to the greenhouse window, all household matters he expects you to understand intuitively. Because Victorian women were supposed to possess some mystical domestic knowledge through sheer osmosis. You stare at the neat rows of numbers, feeling as though you're being evaluated by invisible judges. If you manage the house poorly, it reflects badly on him. If you overspend, it reflects badly on him. If the servants misbehave, somehow it reflects badly on him. Everything flows upward. Every mistake you make becomes his embarrassment, and his embarrassment becomes your punishment. You dip the pen into ink, steadying your hand. This is your work now, except it's not considered real work. It's simply your nature. As if Victorian women were born knowing the price of coal. Suddenly, you hear a faint knock and the door creaks open. A housemaid, young, timid, steps inside and sets down a stack of correspondence. Some letters addressed to him, one addressed to you. The handwriting is elegant, looping, unfamiliar. You open it and read. It's from one of his aunts, congratulating you on the marriage, calling you a lovely addition to the family, advising you to be patient with marital adjustments. And then, the line that twists like a thorn. A wife who manages her household well brings honor to her husband. A wife who questions too much brings unrest. You close the letter, your breath tight. Victorian society didn't just strip your rights. It dressed the stripping in poetry and called it virtue. You set the letter aside and return to the ledger, your mind heavy with the knowledge that your life has been split neatly into two parts, before marriage and your new state of polite erasure. Historians still argue whether the average Victorian wife felt this erasure acutely, or whether the era's relentless conditioning made it feel normal. You suspect it's both. You can already feel your mind bending, reshaping itself around expectations you never agreed to. You close the ledger for now. The house is silent, too silent, And as you sit in your husband's study, a room you have no real authority in, you realize something important. This isn't just his roof. These aren't just his rules. This is his world, and you've been expected to disappear into it. You leave the study with the ledgers still open behind you, feeling as if you've just stepped out of a courtroom where only one person ever gets to testify. The house feels larger now, not because it grew, but because you've suddenly realized how much space isn't actually yours. Your footsteps echo through the hall as you wander into the heart of your new domain, the Victorian home, where domestic life masquerades as elegance, but is built almost entirely on your unpaid, invisible labor. The moment you enter the parlor, the polished beauty of the room hits you like a wave. Everything looks perfect. Too perfect. The furniture is stiff and ornamental, designed for guests rather than comfort. Heavy drapes swallow the light instead of letting it in. The floral wallpaper seems determined to choke the room with charm, and the air, stale with propriety. Victorian homes were gorgeous on the outside, but they were exhausting on the inside. You sink slowly onto the settee, adjusting your skirts as you try to make sense of this new rhythm of married life. A mainstream fact flickers through your thoughts. Middle and upper-class Victorian women were expected to run a household the size of a small business, while simultaneously looking delicate and doing absolutely nothing that resembled actual work. You were expected to be the silent general of a domestic army. The best part? Everyone pretends it's effortless. A quirky historical detail slips into your mind. Etiquette books insisted a Victorian lady should make running a household look natural, as though she were born with an instinct for linen inventories and servant schedules. If you struggled, society didn't adjust its expectations, it scolded you for lacking feminine grace. You glance around the beautifully appointed room and think, grace looks suspiciously like labor. After a few minutes of trying to breathe through the tightness of your corset, you rise and wander into the dining room, where the long table gleams under the morning light. Polished silver, perfect placement, everything arranged like a stage waiting for actors. Except the actors, the guests, the husband, the distant relatives who will judge your hosting skills only see the final presentation. They never see the hours you'll spend planning menus, scheduling servants, ordering groceries, arranging flowers, and writing invitations. All of it your responsibility, none of it acknowledged as real work. You run your fingertips along the polished table, and the weight of it all settles in your chest. Domestic perfection isn't just a social expectation, it's a performance that never ends. This will be your routine now, whispers a voice in the back of your mind. Do everything well, and then do it again tomorrow. As you walk deeper into the house, a maid approaches with a small bow. Ma'am, cook would like your approval for tonight's dinner. Her voice is polite and steady, but her eyes are tired, the eyes of someone who has lived inside this system long enough to understand its sharp edges. You nod and follow her to the kitchen, a place Victorian wives were encouraged to avoid publicly, but secretly depended on for survival. The kitchen is warm, fragrant, and alive. Pots bubbling, bread forming under skilled hands, vegetables chopped with rhythmic efficiency. It's the only room in the house that actually feels like it breathes. The cook shows you the menu: roast beef, potatoes, and a custard for dessert. You approve it, though you know your input is more symbolic than practical. The cook already knows what the household likes, but etiquette requires you to supervise. Supervision, another word for pretend involvement. The truth is, you're responsible for everything that happens in your home, and yet responsible for none of the actions that make it function. As you turn to leave the kitchen, you overhear two scullery maids whispering. You pause, half hidden behind the doorway. She seems kind, one says. New brides always do, the other replies. Give it a few months. The pressure gets to them. Pressure. That word lands hard, because it's true. You're not just managing staff, meals, finances, and decor. You're managing perfection itself. One misstep, one overcooked meal, one dusty corner, one rude servant. And it's your failure, not the household's. You return to the parlor, sinking onto the settee again, and let your eyes drift closed for a moment. Victorian domesticity wasn't about comfort. It was about maintaining an image so flawless that people forgot there were humans inside the house. Historians still argue whether Victorian women believed in these ideals or simply performed them because deviation meant social exile. The answer, you suspect, is complicated. Many did believe, many didn't. But all conformed because not conforming carried consequences. Your breath slows as you take in your surroundings. Domestic life in the Victorian era demanded a particular type of woman, one who moved through her home like a quiet conductor of an invisible symphony, a woman who smiled at guests, soothed servants, balanced budgets, and never let the cracks show. But the cracks are always there. You rise again, restless, and wander upstairs to the morning room, a smaller, quieter space where Victorian wives often retreated to arrange flowers, write letters, or do needlework that made their hands ache. You try to imagine yourself doing those things for decades. Decades. A strange, heavy ache fills your chest. You pick up a piece of embroidery left on the table, delicate roses and vines. The stitches are tiny and perfect, as if made by someone with infinite patience. Victorian society loved activities like this. They made women appear busy without acknowledging the emptiness underneath. You set the embroidery down gently. In the far corner of the room sits a pianoforte. The instrument gleams under the light, ivory keys inviting your touch. Victorian wives were expected to play not professionally, of course, just well enough to impress guests and soothe husbands. You sit at the bench and press a single key. The note rings out, pure and lonely, drifting through the room. Your fingers hover over the keys as memories of childhood lessons float back the pressure to be graceful, talented, and pleasant, all without stepping beyond the invisible boundaries drawn around you. Another note, softer this time, and then another. You play a small melody, something sweet and melancholy, and for a moment, the house feels warmer, more forgiving. Like maybe, just maybe, there is space for you here that doesn't demand perfection, but the moment doesn't last. A clock chimes somewhere in the house, reminding you that time belongs to the household schedule now. You stand, smoothing your skirt, and make your way toward the doorway. Domestic life in the Victorian era wasn't cruel in the obvious ways. It was cruel in the quiet ones, the ways that trickled into your bones, the ways that made you forget where you ended and the house began. You pause at the top of the stairs, gripping the banister. You are not just living in this home, you are expected to become this home. And somewhere beneath the lace, the teacups, the polished silver, and the endless expectations, you feel a small, soft flicker of rebellion. Not enough to change the world, just enough to remind yourself you're still in it. You descend the stairs slowly, your hand gliding along the polished banister. The air feels charged, heavy, almost humming with the invisible rules that govern every inch of Victorian married life. If earlier you felt swallowed by the house itself, now you're about to learn the deeper truth. It isn't the home that controls you, it's the man who legally occupies the center of it, your husband. And today, you get your first real glimpse of his privileges, the ones Victorian society gifts him just for being a man, and the ones you inherit simply by proximity. You enter the front hall just as he steps through the door, his coat dusted with the crisp afternoon air. He looks composed, confident, and utterly unaware of the iceberg of obligations floating beneath your calm expression. You greet him with the polite smile expected of a Victorian wife, soft, warm, modest. A smile that says everything is fine even when you don't know if it is. He removes his gloves and hands them to a waiting servant, not even glancing at the man's face. Victorian husbands rarely needed to. They existed at the top of the household pyramid, where politeness was optional and obedience from others was simply assumed. "Good afternoon," he says, adjusting his cravat in the hallway mirror. "I trust the household matters were manageable?" Manageable. A word that hides more than it reveals. You nod. "Of course." He smiles faintly, clearly satisfied. His expectations of you are simple. Do everything quietly, gracefully and without asking for help. In return, he believes he is granting you the privilege of belonging to a respectable household, a fair exchange, in his eyes. As he walks past you into the drawing room, you feel the shift, subtle but complete. The room changes around him. The furniture feels smaller. The air feels thicker. This isn't just your home anymore. It's his territory. Every painting, every piece of silver, every decision that matters is shaped by him. Victorian husbands didn't merely lead the household. They owned it. You follow him into the drawing room, your steps quiet. He settles into an armchair near the fire, crossing his legs in that relaxed, expansive way men do when there's nothing in the world they fear. You sit across from him, back straight, ankles crossed, hands folded gently in your lap, a delicate mirror of femininity. He begins to talk about his day, business matters, political discussions at the club, a new gentleman who may join his morning riding circle. His voice is even, smooth, unhurried. Everything he says assumes your interest, even if the details mean nothing to you. Victorian wives were expected to listen as though every word was riveting, even when husbands droned on about railway shares or a debate in Parliament that sounded like a group of men arguing over who had the more impressive waistcoat. You try to focus, but your mind wanders. A mainstream fact rises. Husbands under Victorian law could control nearly every aspect of their wives' lives: money, property, movement, friendships, medical care, even the right to leave the house alone. Many wives needed written permission to travel. Some needed it just to visit family. Victorian men were walking permission slips. Your husband casually mentions a dinner invitation for the weekend. Lady Harbury will be hosting. It's important we attend. I'll tell the tailor to send over some fabrics for a new evening gown, something elegant. You blink. He's choosing your dress, not out of courtesy, out of habit. Because Victorian husbands were expected to curate their wives' appearance like selecting art for their homes. Tasteful, appropriate, pleasing. A reflection of himself, he continues speaking, unaware that the thread of his sentence tightened around your ribs. And perhaps you'll avoid the softer blues. They wash out your complexion in evening light. You keep your expression smooth, but inside, a tiny spark flickers. Not anger, not yet, but awareness. This man, who legally owns your home, also believes he owns your aesthetic. He isn't cruel, not intentionally. He's simply Victorian, and Victorian husbands were taught their entire lives that authority was their birthright. He shifts topics again, the new horse he's considering buying, the man at the club who cheats at billiards, the upcoming elections, politics, horses, money worlds you're not supposed to enter. If you dare ask a question too confidently, society labels you unfeminine. If you remain silent, it calls you graceful. You choose silence. He doesn't notice. Historians still argue whether Victorian men genuinely wanted emotional closeness with their wives, or whether they saw marriage as a practical partnership. Some diaries reveal tenderness, others reveal cold distance. Most reveal men who simply didn't consider their wives' feelings as part of the marriage equation. As he speaks, you glance at the mantel clock. Its ticking feels louder now, like a metronome, counting down the moments of a life that's more performance than partnership. Then, a housemaid enters and asks if you'd like tea. Your husband answers before you can speak. She'll have Earl Grey. You inhale slowly, your jaw tight for a heartbeat. He didn't ask you. He didn't check. He just assumed. A soft, polite assumption, but an assumption all the same. One that Victorian society trained men to make without hesitation. The tea arrives. You take a sip. You hate Earl Grey. He doesn't notice. Victorian men rarely notice the preferences of their wives, unless those preferences directly benefited them. Your tastes, your desires, your curiosities. They existed quietly, like pressed flowers in a book, lovely in theory, useless in practice. As the afternoon wanes, he stands and straightens his coat. "I'll be at the club for supper," he says. "Don't wait up." Of course he will. Victorian husbands spent more time at their clubs than with their wives, drinking, smoking, debating politics, escaping responsibility. Clubs were male sanctuaries, places where they could exist without the burden of being emotionally present. You nod, have a pleasant evening. He leaves. The door closes. And for the first time all day, the house feels like it belongs to you again, not entirely, but enough to breathe. You walk slowly back to the parlour window and watch the fog roll down the street. You take another sip of Earl Grey, grimacing. Then you set the cup down and whisper into the empty room. I prefer chamomile. No one hears it. But you do. And maybe that small whisper, that tiny reclaiming of taste, is the first real thing you've said all day. Victorian husbands may have had all the privileges, but Victorian wives had something else. The quiet beginnings of an inner life. A life that, one whisper at a time, might grow louder. The house settles into evening silence, the kind that feels thick enough to wrap around your shoulders. Lantern light flickers against the walls as you climb the stairs, one hand resting lightly on the banister. The day has been long, not physically exhausting, but emotionally heavy, as if every expectation of Victorian marriage has attached itself to you like an extra layer beneath your corset. You pause outside your bedroom door, taking a breath, because tonight your mind wanders into one of the most frightening truths of Victorian married life. One every wife carried like a shadow behind her. Pregnancy. The word alone sends a cold thread down your spine, even though no one has spoken it aloud yet. In this era, you're always either pregnant, about to be pregnant, recovering from being pregnant, or bracing yourself for the next pregnancy. It's the Victorian circle of life, woman's edition. You enter the room and sit by the window, looking out at the dim street. A carriage rattles past, carrying someone home from a dinner party or a late shop closing. Their life continues as normal. Yours feels suspended, waiting for a future you can't control. A mainstream fact slices in. Victorian women averaged 6 to 8 pregnancies. Some had 10. Some had 14. And about 1 in every 4 women didn't survive childbirth. The math isn't comforting. You rest your palm on your abdomen flat, quiet, innocent, and try to imagine the weight of a future child, or 2, or 6, or however many your husband expects, because in this world, children weren't simply family members, they were proof. Proof of fertility, proof of success, proof of your worth as a wife. You exhale shakily. Victorian advice books made pregnancy sound like an inevitable blessing rather than a mortal risk. But you know the whispered stories, the neighbours who took ill after childbirth, the women who vanished from dinner parties after complications, the quiet funerals held behind lace curtains, the kind of things Victorian society never wrote about in newspapers. Your stomach tightens at the memory of your mother's expression the night before, your wedding proud. Yes, but also sad, a shadow behind her eyes, as if she was passing you into something she knew too well, as if she wanted to warn you, but the rules of propriety had wrapped themselves around her voice. You stand and cross the room to your vanity. Sitting down, you examine your reflection in the dim lamplight. You look the same, and yet not. There's a new heaviness in your gaze, a quiet awareness that the body reflected back at you may no longer feel like your own. A quirky Victorian detail pops into your mind. The era's medical manuals insisted that pregnant women should avoid strong emotions, joy, sadness, fear, even excitement, because doctors believed the mother's feelings could imprint on the baby. One physician warned against reading novels while pregnant because fiction created excessive imagination, which supposedly made babies nervous. Imagine that, being expected to carry a child while also avoiding feelings. Victorian logic strikes again. You rise from the vanity and move toward the hearth, kneeling beside the low fire to warm your hands. The flames dance softly, casting long shadows across the room. Your mind drifts to the terrifying truth behind childbirth in this era. Victorian doctors didn't even wash their hands between patients. Historians still argue whether the reluctance to embrace germ theory was ignorance or arrogance. Possibly both. Either way, it cost countless women their lives. You shiver. In the hallway outside your room, you hear faint footsteps, the night maid doing her rounds. The sound is oddly comforting. At least someone in this immense, echoing house is awake with you. You stand and pace across the room. The floor creaks beneath your weight, each step a reminder of how fragile life felt for women in this era. Victorian society celebrated motherhood as the pinnacle of womanhood, but it did nothing to make it safer. Your breath catches as you imagine the moment you might realize you're expecting. The muffled panic, the polite congratulations, the nausea that isn't only morning sickness, but fear. Your husband, of course, would beam with pride. Children are his legacy, his triumph. Your survival? Secondary. You sit on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping softly beneath you. A woman of your class would be expected to announce the news with a certain glow, that delicate, angelic smile. Victorian portraits loved to exaggerate, but what they never painted were the quiet tears at night, the constant dread of losing oneself in a cycle of pregnancies without space to breathe. You touch the fold of your nightdress. Victorian women weren't encouraged to understand their own bodies. No education, no autonomy, no reliable medicine. Everything about pregnancy was shrouded in silence. The symptoms, the pain, the dangers. You had to endure it like a secret ritual. Your mother did it. Your grandmother did it. And now, whether you're ready or not, you will too. You picture the lying-in room, a tradition that required women to stay confined in a darkened space for weeks before and after childbirth. Shades drawn, air stifling, visitors kept away, all in the name of protecting the mother, though no one could explain why darkness mattered more than hygiene. Victorian medicine was full of mysteries no one dared question. Your mind drifts through the imagined timeline. The swelling belly, the aching back, the fainting spells your corset would absolutely worsen, the whispers of midwives and physicians, the agony disguised as divine duty, and then the moment of birth. Some women prayed, some screamed, some dissociated entirely, and some, too many, never opened their eyes afterward. A faint tap interrupts your thoughts. A maid appears in the doorway, holding a folded towel. "Just setting things out for the morning, ma'am," she whispers. You nod, offering a small smile. She hesitates, then quietly adds, "My mum had 11 children, miss. Only 5 lived past infancy. She always said the hardest part wasn't the pain. It was the fear that never left her." Your breath trembles. The maid flushes with embarrassment for speaking out of turn. "Begging your pardon," she murmurs. "No," you whisper. "Thank you." She slips out, closing the door softly behind her. You lie back on the bed, staring up at the canopy. Shadows dance across the fabric. Fear curls deep in your chest. But so does something else, a strange resilience. Victorian women suffered, yes, but they also endured, held families together, survived on hope and stubbornness, and the quiet bravery no one applauded. Perhaps you will too, but as your eyes drift toward the window where the fog thins and moonlight rests gently on the glass, you know the truth. Pregnancy in Victorian England wasn't just a biological possibility. It was a looming destiny, a destiny that could shape your life, or take it. You wake the next morning with a dull ache behind your eyes, the kind that comes not from lack of sleep but from thinking too much. The fog has settled over the street again, curling around chimneys and softening the harsh edges of the world. You press your palms to your temples and breathe slowly, trying to gather yourself, because today you step deeper into a Victorian wife's greatest, most exhausting duty. One no etiquette book could soften, and no polite parlour conversation could hide. Motherhood. Not the painted versions seen in sentimental portraits, not the gentle lullabies whispered in nurseries lined with lace. No, the real Victorian motherhood, the constant, pounding, bone-deep labour that never ends. You rise and move to the window. Pushing aside the heavy curtain, a street sweeper drags his broom through the morning drizzle. A milk cart clatters. Somewhere in the distance, a child cries a high, sharp sound that threads through the air like a reminder. Childhood in this era is fragile, unpredictable, and often heartbreakingly short. You place a hand on the window frame, the cold wood grounding you. Victorian mothers lived with fear as a daily companion. Infant mortality was so common that families didn't celebrate a child's survival until after the first birthday. Sometimes not even then. Newspapers printed death notices for toddlers beside advertisements for sewing needles and hair tonics, as if loss were just another household inconvenience. A mainstream fact floats into your mind. Nearly 15% of Victorian children didn't survive past age 5. For poorer families, the numbers were even worse. You blink slowly. It's not just pregnancy that haunts Victorian women. It's what comes after. You move to the vanity and begin brushing your hair. Long strokes that help quiet your racing thoughts. The nursery down the hall is empty now, prepared by servants months before your wedding. A crib waits. A rocking chair waits. The room itself waits, patient, silent, looming. Victorian society treats motherhood as your inevitable destiny, the final proof of your womanhood. A home without children is seen as incomplete. A wife without children is whispered about, pitied, or suspected of failing her duties. Historians still argue whether Victorian women genuinely wanted large families or whether they simply had no real alternative. Birth control was primitive at best, inaccessible at worst, and often illegal or immoral by society's standards. The result? Women were trapped in a cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, mourning, and starting again. You set the brush down with a quiet clink. Motherhood here isn't just a role, it's a sentence. Yet amid all of this, Victorian mothers were expected to be the emotional backbone of the family, endlessly patient, endlessly nurturing, endlessly composed. Even grief had rules. Too much visible sorrow made people uncomfortable. Too little made you heartless. You descend the stairs, your dress swaying around your ankles. The parlour smells faintly of lavender water. A servant must have cleaned early. You take a seat at a table near the fireplace just as the housemaid brings tea. "Ma'am," she says softly. Her eyes linger on you just a moment too long enough for you to see something unspoken. Maybe she knows the path that lies ahead of you. Maybe she walked a similar road before entering service. Maybe she's seen too many young mistresses fade into exhaustion behind nursery doors. You sip your tea, the warmth spreading through your chest but doing little to ease the heaviness inside you. Your husband enters a few minutes later, nodding politely as he takes a seat opposite you. He unfolds his newspaper, rustling the pages with the confidence of a man who hasn't thought once about the possibility of losing a child. Victorian fathers loved to talk about legacy, but rarely about fear. "How are you feeling?" he asks casually, eyes scanning the headlines. "I'm well," you reply, because anything more complicated than that isn't considered suitable breakfast conversation. He doesn't look up. "Good. My mother stopped by yesterday, while you were resting. She mentioned the preparations for the nursery. She wants to ensure it's done properly." Your fingers tighten around your teacup. Victorian mothers-in-law had a reputation for inserting themselves into household matters, especially anything related to childbirth or raising children. They saw it as their duty, their responsibility, their right. "She worries," he adds. "You know how women are." The sentence hovers in the air like a slap, gentle in tone, brutal in meaning. You offer a small nod, swallowing words that don't belong in this room. He turns a page of the newspaper. "My business partner's wife is expecting again. Their fourth. A strong family name requires strong heirs." There it is. Not encouragement, not affection, not reassurance. Expectations. The desire for a strong family name sits heavy in your chest. To him, future children represent legacy and stability. To you, they represent months of risk, pain, and uncertainty. But you don't say that. A Victorian wife's fears are meant to stay tucked inside her ribcage, hidden beneath lace and composure. He folds the newspaper finally, standing to leave. "I'll be out most of the day. Dinner at the club." He pauses. "You should rest. Stress is not good for a woman's health." You almost laugh at the absurdity. Victorian women were allowed everything except actual emotional expression. After he leaves, the house falls quiet again. Too quiet. You make your way upstairs to the nursery. The door creaks as you open it. The room is pristine. Too pristine. Sunlight filters through lace curtains, dust motes dancing like tiny ghosts. A small carved crib sits near the window. Its blankets neatly folded, a rocking chair rests in the corner. Shelves hold children's books, with moral lessons about obedience and purity. You step inside cautiously, as if the stillness might break under your breath. Your fingers brush the edge of the crib. The wood is smooth, polished, cold. You imagine a future child here, small, delicate, fragile. A heartbeat the size of a sparrow's. You also imagine empty arms. The two images pulse together in your mind, and your breath trembles. Behind you, the maid appears quietly, almost apologetically. "Begging pardon, ma'am," she murmurs. "Shall I open the window?" You shake your head. She lingers, hesitating. "My sister had 8, ma'am," she whispers. "Only the youngest 3 survived. But she said the ones she lost still lived in the corners of her heart. Always." Your throat tightens. Perhaps Victorian motherhood is exactly that, a heart full of corners, each holding memories too tender to touch. You nod gently. "Thank you." She curtsies and leaves. You stay a little longer, tracing the crib's edge, letting the quiet settle around you like a second skin. Motherhood in this era is not a soft story. It's a war fought in silence, a battle between hope and fear that every woman carries alone. Finally, you turn toward the door. The nursery waits behind you, patient and constant. Your future waits, too full of uncertainty, exhaustion, love, and loss. You step into the hallway, feeling the weight of it all. And for the first time, you whisper to yourself, "I'm not ready." But in Victorian England, readiness didn't matter. Duty did. You leave the nursery with your pulse still unsteady, the echo of the maid's words drifting behind you like a soft, lingering ghost. The hallway feels colder now, narrower. The polished floorboards creak beneath you as though warning you that once you take the next step, you enter yet another territory of Victorian womanhood, one just as suffocating, dangerous, and quietly brutal. Medicine. Or, rather, what Victorians thought medicine was. You descend the stairs slowly, your hand brushing the wallpaper. If pregnancy was frightening, then Victorian healthcare was an entirely different kind of nightmare. A place where superstition dressed up as science, where male doctors clung to outdated theories like life rafts, and where women's pain was treated with a shrug, a lecture, or a prescription that often made things worse. You step into the morning parlor, where the light is beginning to strengthen behind the curtains. A tea tray arrives, but you barely touch it. This morning, your thoughts drift to the countless stories, whispered among women, stories about fainting couches, delicate nerves, and physicians who considered female suffering a personality trait. A mainstream fact drops into your mind like a cold pebble. Victorian doctors believed women were naturally fragile, emotional, and biologically designed for suffering. They viewed pain, especially women's pain, as a moral lesson rather than a medical issue. You sit down, resting your hands on the embroidered cushion, and try to imagine how many women have sat exactly like this, hurting, scared, ignored. In this era, a woman with almost any symptom, exhaustion, anxiety, irritability, pain, depression, could be diagnosed with the same catch-all condition, hysteria. You've heard the word your entire life. It floats through Victorian society like perfume, sweet-sounding but poisonous. Hysteria could mean anything and nothing. Lump in your throat? Hysteria. Trouble sleeping? Hysteria. Too emotional? Hysteria. Not emotional enough? Still hysteria. You rest your fingertips against your temples and sigh. It's almost funny in a dark, terrible way. A quirky historical detail pops in next. Victorian doctors believed the uterus was capable of wandering around the body, causing emotional disturbances. Yes, wandering. Like a lost tourist navigating through the lungs and liver. If it weren't terrifying, you'd laugh. You press your lips together as you remember the physician who came to visit the morning after your wedding. A formality, he said, just to check your constitution. He had barely looked at you. Instead, he asked your husband questions about your health, as though your body were a parcel he'd recently acquired. You sat there quietly, nodding at the appropriate moments, even though the only thing he diagnosed accurately was your ability to sit still. Victorian doctors rarely trusted female patients. They trusted their husbands, their fathers, their brothers, anyone but the woman actually experiencing pain. Before you can dwell too long on the memory, a soft knock interrupts you. A maid enters. "Ma'am, Dr. Pembroke is here for the household rounds. The master requested he speak with you as well." Of course he did. Victorian husbands often summoned doctors on behalf of their wives, usually without asking. Many believed a woman's health was simply an extension of his responsibility, like property maintenance or stable management. You steel yourself as Dr. Pembroke steps into the room. He's in his late 50s, with silver hair, a dignified beard, and an expression that suggests he's seen far too many lacy curtains and far too few actual symptoms. He bows slightly. "Good morning, Mrs. Harwood. The master mentioned you've seemed thoughtful. The polite Victorian way of saying concerning. You smile gently. "I'm quite well." He nods in that patronizing manner older men have perfected over centuries. Women often say that, but their nerves tell a different story. "How have your spirits been since the wedding?" "My spirits?" you echo, eyebrows tightening before you can stop them. "Any restlessness, irritability, tearfulness, faint spells, unsettled dreams?" You almost snort. That list describes every Victorian woman who has ever existed. "I'm simply adjusting," you say calmly. "And how is your appetite?" he continues. Women of your constitution often show early signs through appetite changes. Your breath catches as you translate the hidden implication. He's looking for signs of pregnancy. Already. You swallow and answer carefully. "My appetite is normal." He scribbles something in his notebook, probably something unhelpful and bold like nerves unstable. Victorian physicians loved diagnosing things you didn't have. It made them feel knowledgeable. He asks a few more vague questions, clucking sympathetically at your every response, then closes his notebook with a satisfied snap. "Exhaustion is common in young wives," he says, as though reciting a script. "A short tonic and daily rest should improve your humours." Humours. Another delightful Victorian medical leftover from medieval times, as if your internal organs run on seasonal produce. "What kind of tonic?" you ask. He waves his hand dismissively. "Something mild, laudanum." Your stomach drops. Laudanum. A lovely Victorian mixture of opium and alcohol, given to women for headaches, sorrow, cramps, or simply existing. Highly addictive, widely prescribed, perfect for calming inconvenient wives. Historians still debate whether Victorian doctors genuinely believed laudanum was harmless or whether they simply didn't care about its long-term effects. Judging by the number of women who lived half their lives in a drugged fog, the answer seems painfully obvious. "That won't be necessary," you say gently but firmly. He pauses. Surprised Victorian wives rarely contradicted their doctors. "Are you sure, Mrs. Harwood? Your nerves." "My nerves," you interrupt quietly, "will be fine." He studies you for a moment, clearly unsure whether to insist, but something in your gaze tells him you won't budge. "Very well," he finally concedes. "But do inform the master, if anything." Shifts. He leaves with a stiff bow. As the door closes, you exhale shakily. The room feels larger, as if reclaiming the air he took with him. You clutch the arm of your chair, grounding yourself. Victorian medicine wasn't designed to heal you, it was designed to manage you. You realize this now, more clearly than ever. The era's medical system treats men as rational beings with symptoms, and women as emotional creatures with sensibilities. Pain becomes personality, symptoms become weakness, and anything that doesn't fit the narrow definition of feminine calmness gets labeled as hysteria or nerves. You rise from your chair, pacing slowly across the parlor. If one day you do become pregnant, you know exactly what awaits you. Doctors who dismiss your discomfort, medicines that numb you more than they heal, advice based on superstition rather than science, a maternal fate shaped by men who never experience it themselves. You pause by the mantle, running your hand across its smooth surface. It's unsettling, realizing your life is shaped so profoundly by people whose expertise is questionable at best, dangerous at worst. You take a deep breath. Victorian medicine may fail you, but you know one thing to be true. You must learn to listen to your own body more carefully than anyone else. A flicker of determination warms your chest, because if this era insists on treating you like a fragile creature, you'll simply have to become stronger in ways they cannot see. You stay in the parlor long after Dr. Pembroke leaves, watching the dust motes swirl in the afternoon sunlight like tiny planets caught in their own quiet orbits. The silence settles around you, heavy and velvet soft, giving you too much time to think about the next invisible weight of Victorian marriage. Not the laws, not the medicine, not even the looming threat of motherhood. Something quieter, sharper, harder to escape. Expectation. Relentless, suffocating, society-wide expectation. You rise from the chair and step into the hallway, the thick carpet muffling your footsteps. Victorian homes are designed to hide noise. Victorian wives, it seems, are expected to hide everything else. As you move into the sitting room, you catch your reflection in the mirror over the mantelpiece. Pale, composed, polite. The very image Victorian society demands of a wife. A woman must always look calm, even when she is breaking, must always look modest, even when the world stares at her like an exhibit, must always look agreeable, even when every instinct within her whispers no. You step closer to the mirror, examining your expression. A Victorian wife is meant to be lovely, but never vain, graceful, but not bold, delicate, but also endlessly capable of domestic miracles. She must look pure but also fertile, innocent but also ready for marital duty. A lady, a mother, a hostess, a moral compass, a family ornament. Too many roles for one woman, none of them optional. Your fingertips graze the mirror's edge. A mainstream fact drifts up from somewhere deep within memory. Victorian society believed women were the moral guardians of the home. If anything went wrong, a rude servant, a poorly cooked meal, a misbehaving child, even a husband with wandering eyes, people blamed the wife for falling short in her feminine duty. You feel the weight of that expectation settle on your shoulders like a shawl made of stone. You walk toward the fireplace and kneel beside it, feeding a small log into the embers. The flames catch quickly, crackling in that familiar way that almost calms your nerves. Almost, because you can't stop thinking about the other expectations, the ones whispered behind gloved hands at afternoon teas, written between the lines of etiquette manuals, and passed from mother to daughter like heirlooms. A wife must never raise her voice. A wife should not contradict her husband in public. A wife must maintain her beauty for her husband's pride. A wife should avoid strong opinions unless they mirror her husband's. A wife must conceal discontent, for it embarrasses the household. Victorians turned womanhood into performance, and the audience was always watching. You stand and move to the window, staring out at the carriage rolling past. The street outside holds a world of people you must constantly impress. Neighbors who gossip, shopkeepers who judge, even strangers who glance at you from passing carriages carry expectations of what a respectable wife should be. A quirky detail slips in. Many Victorian women kept morality diaries, where they wrote daily confessions of any minor failure, speaking too sharply, walking too quickly, appearing too cheerful, looking too tired. eating more than the expected portion, even thinking an improper thought. Self-surveillance disguised as virtue. You imagine yourself writing in such a diary, noting every unladylike moment, frowned while reading, spoke too directly, looked out the window too long, felt tired, exhausting. You turn away from the window and head toward the staircase. As you ascend, your skirt brushing softly against each step, the whisper of fabric feels like the quiet shaming of society. Elegant, composed, perfect, even when you're unraveling inside. Halfway up the stairs, you pause. A framed portrait hangs on the wall, a Victorian couple painted decades ago. The husband stands confidently, one hand resting on a polished cane. The wife sits beside him, eyes lowered, smile soft, posture immaculate. She looks empty. You stare at her for a long moment. She is beautiful. She is poised. She is utterly, painfully silent. You climb the rest of the stairs to escape her stare, but her ghost walks behind you, the ghost of every Victorian woman, swallowed by social expectation. In your bedroom, a new dress lies folded across the bed. The maids must have laid it out for tonight's dinner. It's lovely, deep green silk with lace trimming, but it feels like a costume more than clothing. You sit beside it, running your hand along the smooth fabric. This dress is not for comfort, not for expression, not even for yourself. It is for them, for him, for the endless eyes evaluating whether you perform your role well enough. Victorian fashion is beautiful, yes, but also restrictive, symbolic of the very society that shapes you. Corsets that restrict your breath, gloves that hide your touch, petticoats that weigh you down, skirts that force you to move slowly, delicately, carefully. A daily reminder. You must take up space beautifully, but never boldly. As you lift the dress, you remember another mainstream truth. Victorian women were judged harshly if they aged visibly. Wrinkles, tired eyes, or faded complexions weren't simply signs of time, they were moral failings. Only careless, undisciplined women let themselves go. Even aging was a performance. You place the dress back on the bed, your throat tightening. A soft knock at the door pulls you from your spiraling thoughts. A maid enters with a small bouquet roses, pale and perfect. "Ma'am," she whispers. "These arrived from Mrs. Blackley across the street. A welcome to the neighborhood." You thank her, but as the maid leaves, you stare at the flowers with unease. Not because they aren't beautiful, they are, but because they represent something more. Mrs. Blackley is watching you. Her welcome gift is also a reminder that your behavior, your attire, your smile, everything you do will be reported and discussed. You place the roses on the vanity. Their petals are soft, flawless. Unlike you, they aren't supposed to survive more than a few days. You sit before the mirror again, your eyes meeting your own reflection, a woman shaped by pressure, expectation, and a society that mistakes silence for virtue. Historians still debate whether Victorian women internalized these expectations willingly or whether centuries of conditioning made them seem natural. Some diaries show women embracing the ideals enthusiastically. Others reveal cracks beneath the surface, bitterness, exhaustion, longing for something more. You lean closer to the mirror. Your reflection blinks back at you, composed, polite, lonely. You touch your cheek gently, as if reassuring yourself that you're real, beyond the reflection, beyond the expectations. Tonight, you will dress up, smile, converse, and perform the role society demands. But for now, privately, silently, you allow yourself one small rebellion. You let yourself feel everything they say you shouldn't. Pain, fear, restlessness, hope, and beneath it all, a spark of self still burning. Because even in a world built to shape you into something ornamental, something obedient, something flawless, you remain human. And that is the one expectation Victorian society cannot fully erase. You stay seated at the vanity longer than you intended, your eyes drifting across the pale roses on the table. Their scent lingers softly in the air, sweet, restrained. pleasant in that distinctly Victorian way that always seems just one breath away from suffocating. You inhale, slow and steady, as if the perfume itself is a reminder of everything expected from you. Beauty, refinement, and above all, composure. But as you rise and walk toward the bedroom window, you know the truth settling deep into your bones. Victorian life isn't built on honesty. It's built on appearances carefully crafted, endlessly maintained, and brutally judged. Keeping up appearances isn't just part of marriage, it is marriage. You draw the curtains back and watch the street below. The day has settled into that gentle late afternoon calm, where the sun hits the rooftops at a warm angle, and neighbours perform their daily rituals of being seen. A lady in a lavender gown steps out of a carriage with calculated elegance, pausing just long enough for anyone nearby to admire her. A gentleman tips his hat too deeply, but clearly for show. Two older women on a bench lean toward one another, whispering so animatedly that you don't need to hear their words to know their subject is someone else's misstep. Victorian society is always watching and always talking. You turn away from the window, a slow breath escaping your lips. It isn't paranoia, it's reality. The walls of Victorian homes are thick, but gossip moves through them like smoke. A misplaced comment over tea, a slightly wrinkled dress, a servant behaving improperly. Each tiny deviation becomes a topic for the neighbourhood's unofficial sport, collective judgment. A mainstream fact drifts to mind. In Victorian England, reputation wasn't simply a social accessory. It was currency. A wife's entire social value, her husband's status, even the future prospects of her children depended on the consistency of her public image. You walk downstairs into the main hall, the familiar cold marble meeting your slippers. A maid hurries past without meeting your eyes. She knows how fragile the boundary between proper household and scandalous disaster can be. If the servants slip, you look incompetent. If you slip, the household looks unsalvageable. The drawing room awaits you with its immaculate arrangement, the sofa angled just so, the lace doilies perfectly aligned, the mantels dusted to an almost obsessive degree. All of it signals to visitors that you run a tight ship, that your husband made an excellent choice in marrying you. You sit gracefully on the sofa, even though you're alone. Victorian wives practice their posture the way pianists practice scales, not because anyone is watching at this moment, but because someone could be watching later. This is the exhausting part. It never turns off. As you glance at the clock, a memory flickers your mother, tightening your corset before your engagement party, whispering, "A woman's reputation is like fine china. Once cracked, even the strongest glue can't hide the lines." At the time, it sounded poetic. Now, it sounds terrifying. A soft knock interrupts your thoughts. It's the maid again, carrying a letter on a silver tray. "From Mrs. Blackley, ma'am," she says. Of course, the roses were the first warning shot. The letter is the follow-up. You open it delicately. The handwriting is elegant, precise, the kind that looks like it was written by someone trained to make even her penmanship appear graceful. "My dear Mrs. Harwood, I trust you are settling well into your new home. Several ladies and I are planning an afternoon tea next Thursday, and we should be delighted for you to join us. It will be a small, intimate gathering, nothing overwhelming. Do wear something light and becoming. Warmest regards, Clara Blackley." You close the letter with a sigh. Intimate gathering, translation, your entrance exam into local society. Wear something light and becoming, translation, we will absolutely judge your dress. You fold the letter carefully, because even paper must be handled politely. Behind you, the maid lingers in the doorway, eyes flicking between you and the ornate carpet. "Everything all right, ma'am?" she asks timidly. "Yes," you say softly. "Just another invitation." She nods, but her expression reveals she understands more than she lets on. You rise from the sofa and head to the hallway mirror. This time, you examine yourself not for beauty, but for readiness. Are you polished enough? Calm enough? Pleasant enough? Victorian society didn't want authenticity from wives. It wanted perfection, preferably effortless, even when it took hours of preparation. Historians still argue whether Victorian women supported these expectations or merely endured them to survive. Most diaries suggest a mix of compliance, frustration, and subtle rebellion, silent resistance beneath layers of lace. You smooth your hair, adjusting a few stray strands. It's absurd. Really, the pressure to appear flawless when life behind closed doors is anything but. A husband who doesn't see you, a medical system that doesn't listen, a future filled with childbirth and fear. And yet, the world will judge your worth by your posture and your smile at a tea party. The injustice burns quietly. You turn away from the mirror and walk into the dining room. The maids are setting the table for supper, polished cutlery, folded napkins, crystal glasses gleaming under soft gaslight. They don't know your heart is pounding. They don't know your mind is spinning with all the invisible rules you must uphold. Your husband's footsteps echo from the main hallway. Here we go. He enters with the casual confidence of a man who has never worried about appearances a day in his life. He kisses your hand lightly, an affectionate gesture, but also performative, something he knows society admires. "You look lovely," he says. You smile politely. "Thank you. I've arranged for a carriage tomorrow. We're visiting Lady Mayfair's estate. She wishes to meet you." Your breath halts. Lady Mayfair, one of the most influential women in the district, known for sharp etiquette, sharper opinions, and an uncanny ability to ruin reputations with a single raised eyebrow. Your husband seems oblivious to the tension curling inside you. "It will be a good opportunity," he says. "First impressions matter." Of course they do. Victorian society forgives almost anything from men. From women? Never. After supper, he leaves for his evening cigar in the study, and you return to the sitting room. The fading light paints the walls gold. The house is quiet, except for the ticking clock and the distant murmurs of servants finishing their tasks. You sit alone on the velvet sofa, hands folded, posture perfect, rehearsing the version of yourself you must carry into tomorrow. Calm, but not cold. Soft, but not weak. Polished, but not vain. Modest, but not invisible. Friendly, but not forward. It feels like balancing on a tightrope woven from threads of expectation. A tiny laugh escapes your throat, tired, breathless. Victorians called this grace. You call it survival. Keeping up appearances may not be the cruelest part of marriage, but it is the part that never ends. And as the last of the sunlight fades, you understand something quietly devastating. You are never truly yourself here. You are whoever they need you to be. Night settles over the house like a heavy velvet curtain, muffling sound, softening corners, and deepening every shadow. The lamps flicker, their warm glow trembling as if even the flame itself is unsure. You sit on the edge of your bed, hands folded carefully in your lap, staring at nothing in particular. A strange hollowness has begun to bloom inside your chest, subtle at first, like a faint bruise, but growing heavier with each passing day. This is the part of Victorian marriage no one writes about in etiquette books. The part that hides behind lace curtains and polite smiles, the slow unraveling of the mind, the emotional suffocation, the quiet descent into what Victorians called hysteria. You press your fingers against your temples, feeling the pressure build. You're not ill. You're not irrational. You're not unstable. You're simply drowning in a life designed to smother you. You lie back gently, the bed creaking beneath your weight. The ceiling above you is ornate, swirling patterns of plaster that Victorian architects believed brought elegance to a room. But as you stare at the pattern, it begins to twist in your vision, warping into shapes that feel too elaborate, too busy, too overwhelming. It mirrors the noise inside your head, constant expectation with nowhere to escape. Your breaths come shallow and uneven. This is what no one warned you about, the loneliness that sits not beside you, but inside you. The way each day becomes a performance. The way silence becomes a companion so constant that you start talking to it just for company. You roll onto your side, curling up slightly. Your corset has been removed for the night, but the phantom pressure lingers around your ribs, your thoughts, your sanity. Victorian women were praised for their nervous delicacy, as if fragility were a badge of honor. But what they called delicacy was often something far darker: depression, anxiety, isolation, exhaustion. And instead of compassion, women received diagnoses. A mainstream fact cuts through your thoughts. The Victorian era saw an explosion of mental health misdiagnoses: melancholia, female madness, hysteria, nervous weakness, or moral insanity. All catch-all terms for women who are unhappy, unheard, or simply overwhelmed. You close your eyes tightly. If you told your husband how you feel, he would likely summon Dr. Pembroke again, and Dr. Pembroke would prescribe rest, tonic, sedation, or recommend a rest cure, the infamous treatment that confined women to bed for weeks or months, forbidding them to read, write, think, or engage in any stimulating activity. The cure for loneliness was, apparently, more loneliness. Your throat tightens at the very idea. You sit up suddenly, unable to lie still any longer. The room feels too small, too silent, too expectant. You cross the floor and open the window slightly, letting cold night air brush your skin. The breeze smells faintly of damp stone and chimney smoke, grounding, real, alive. You breathe deeply, letting the coldness anchor you. Down in the street, a lamplighter finishes his rounds. His lantern sways, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. You watch him for a moment, wishing irrationally, desperately, that you could trade places with him. His life may be simple, but it is his. He walks where he wants. His mind belongs to him. Yours feels like borrowed space. You close the window and wrap your shawl around your shoulders. As you move across the room, your gaze lands on a fainting couch, the piece of furniture Victorian women were expected to use whenever their emotions became too much. But the couch wasn't made for fainting. It was made for silence, for hiding, for suffering politely. You sit down slowly, running your hand along the curve of the wooden frame. This couch has held countless women before you. Women whose minds buckled under the same pressures. Women who whispered their fears into the embroidered cushions because no one else would listen. Women who learned that breaking quietly was better than screaming loudly. Victorian homes weren't just beautiful. They were containment chambers for female emotion. You lean back, closing your eyes for a moment, trying to collect yourself. But the thoughts don't slow. They swirl. They tighten. They circle like birds searching for a place to land. Another memory surfaces, something you overheard from the maid. Her cousin, locked away in a small country asylum for mania after the death of her second child. Mania, they called it, even though she was simply grieving. Victorian society had no space for a mother's anguish. A clean household needed clean emotions. You shiver. Historians still debate how many Victorian women were institutionalized for emotional distress rather than true mental illness. But the truth is painfully clear. Being unhappy could be considered madness if you were a woman. A quiet knock at the door pulls you back. "Ma'am," a maid whispers softly, pushing the door open a sliver. "The master asked that you join him in the drawing room before bed." Of course he did. Appearance must be maintained. Even at night, you nod and rise, smoothing your dress. Your hands tremble slightly, but you hide them in the folds of your skirt. When you enter the drawing room, your husband is seated in an armchair, sipping port. The smell of the liquor is strong, heavy, and you sense instantly that he is relaxed in a way you are not allowed to be. He gestures for you to sit. "You seemed quiet today," he says, not unkindly, but not with concern either. More like he's observing a minor flaw in household routine. "I'm adjusting," you answer. He takes another sip. "Well, women grow into marriage. It takes time. Some nerves are normal." There it is, the word you've come to despise. Nerves. the Victorian umbrella term for everything a man could not understand and did not care to learn. You sit stiffly, listening to him talk about trivial matters, nodding when appropriate, performing calmness even though your mind feels like it is fraying along the edges. The conversation is short, polite, empty. When you finally return to your room, your chest feels tight. You undress slowly, methodically, as though moving too quickly might cause you to shatter. The maid helps you out of your corset, her fingers gentle but efficient. She doesn't ask questions. Servants are trained to notice without speaking, to understand without acknowledging. Before leaving, she pauses. "Ma'am," she whispers, "if you ever need anything, if you ever feel unwell, you can ring for me." Her voice is soft, human, a lifeline in a sea of expectations. You nod gratefully. After she leaves, you slip beneath the blankets. The lamp flickers once, twice, then steadies. You lie very still, staring into the dim room. You're not losing your mind. You're being crushed by a life that never lets you breathe. The madness isn't inside you. It's around you, pressed into the walls, woven into the fabric, baked into the expectations. And as sleep slowly pulls you under, one thought echoes quietly in your mind. If Victorian wives seem fragile, maybe it's because they were never allowed to be real. Morning light creeps slowly across the bedroom ceiling, thin and hesitant, as if even the sun is wary of entering a Victorian marriage. You blink awake to the soft chiming of a distant clock and the faint rustle of servants beginning their workday. The house feels different this morning, colder, heavier, almost watchful. As though it knows today you will face one of the most difficult truths about Victorian life. Your husband doesn't just hold social power. He holds legal, emotional, and absolute personal power. You sit up, pulling the blankets close against the lingering chill. Your husband has already left the bed, and the space beside you is cool, a stark contrast to the oppressive weight of his authority. It's strange how a person can be physically absent, yet overwhelmingly present in every corner of your day. You rise slowly and dress with the help of the maid. Layers of petticoats, corsets, and sleeves wrap around you, like a suit of ceremonial armor, beautiful but burdensome. Victorian fashion isn't just clothing. It's a reminder of who you are expected to be. Restrained, decorous, contained. The maid pulls the corset laces tighter. You inhale sharply. She apologizes softly, but you can see in her eyes that she's done this countless times for countless mistresses. Tight corsets, tight rules, tight lives. All of it a slow, silent constriction. As you descend the staircase, you see your husband's study door ajar. Papers lie neatly arranged on the desk, financial ledgers, property documents, correspondence with influential men, all belonging to him, only him. Victorian men lived with a type of freedom you can barely comprehend. You linger in the doorway, your hand lightly grazing the frame. A mainstream fact surfaces. Under Victorian law, your husband controls everything you own, everything you earn, and everything you are. Your inherited possessions become his. Your income, if you are permitted to have any, becomes his. Even your body, legally, belongs to him. In this moment, standing at the threshold of his study, you feel that truth press into you like cold iron. A stack of sealed letters sits on the table. Some are related to his business. Some are social invitations. But one in particular catches your eye, addressed to your husband from his solicitor. You can't make out the contents from here, but the seal alone reminds you that you have no right to open it. The law sees you as incapable of understanding such matters. What's worse, Victorian society sees that as natural. You step away from the study before the injustice gnaws too deeply into you. In the breakfast room, a servant brings tea, toast, and fruit. You sit quietly, trying to eat, but something feels wrong, as though the air has thickened. You feel watched, not by the servants, not by your husband, by the weight of expectation itself, the expectation that you must accept everything, endure everything, and question nothing. The door opens, and your husband enters impeccably dressed, smelling faintly of cologne and the cold morning air. He kisses your cheek lightly, a gesture that feels more ceremonial than affectionate. "Good morning," he says, pouring himself coffee. "I'll need you to attend a charity meeting later today. My absence would reflect poorly on us." On us, though, he means on him. You nod, though your stomach tightens. Charity meetings are not gatherings of kindness. They are gatherings of scrutiny, a place where wealthy women measure one another's worth by their posture, philanthropy, and ability to silently obey social rules. "I also spoke with the solicitor yesterday," he adds casually. "There are some property matters to settle regarding your father's old estate." Your pulse quickens. "My father's estate?" you repeat softly. "Yes," he says, buttering his toast. "It's in your name, technically. But of course, all legal decisions fall to me now." "Of course." The words slide off his tongue smoothly, effortlessly, like reciting a fact so unquestionable that it might as well be gravity. You swallow hard, the toast suddenly dry in your mouth. You want to protest. You want to ask questions. You want to say, "It was my home before it was yours." But in Victorian marriage, a wife voicing displeasure is hysterical. A wife questioning her husband is improper. A wife wanting control is unnatural. He continues eating without noticing the devastation in your eyes. After breakfast, he leaves for the day, coat buttoned, hat in place, stride confident. He doesn't ask how you'll spend your time. He doesn't need to. The unspoken assumption is clear. Your job is to manage the house, maintain appearances, and exist gracefully. As the front door shuts behind him, the silence becomes suffocating. You retreat into the sitting room, curling up on the fainting couch. You rub your hands together slowly, trying to warm them. Victorian houses are cold, but not nearly as cold as the realization forming inside your chest. Your husband doesn't need to control you overtly. The system controls you for him. You close your eyes and think of the hundreds of ways Victorian husbands exercise their power. They could forbid friendships, limit movement, dictate clothing, control money, choose where the family lives, decide when or if their wives saw relatives, and in darker cases, use physical force with no legal consequence. Historians still debate how common the harshest forms of control were, but even in kinder marriages, the imbalance was absolute. You open your eyes again as a sudden noise echoes down the hall. The housemaid accidentally dropped a silver tray. You hear a sharp reprimand from the butler. The girl apologizes frantically, her voice trembling. You recognize the desperation instantly. Fear. The fear of disappointing someone who controls your future. You and the maid are different in class, but painfully similar in reality. A Victorian man controls her salary. A Victorian man controls your life. Both of you survive by pleasing him. The thought sends a chill through you. Later, you move to your writing desk in your room and pull out paper. You begin a letter to your mother, hoping for comfort. But halfway through the first sentence, you stop. You cannot write the truth. You cannot say, "I feel trapped." You cannot say, "I feel erased." You cannot say, "I am scared." Victorian letters are often read aloud to husbands. Privacy is a luxury you no longer own. You crumple the paper slowly. Instead, you write something polite, cheerful, carefully curated, the written equivalent of a forced smile. "My marriage is settling nicely. The household keeps me busy. I am doing well." Lie after lie after lie. You seal it, tears pricking behind your eyes. By the time afternoon arrives, you sit in the hallway waiting for the carriage that will take you to the charity meeting, the next stage of your performance. Servants bustle around as though the house itself is preparing you for display. You catch a glimpse of yourself in the mirror. You look beautiful. You look graceful. You look like a woman who belongs here. But behind your eyes, something is cracking. Quietly, carefully, invisibly. Your husband doesn't see it. Society won't acknowledge it. Victorian marriage won't allow it. Yet the truth remains. Your life doesn't belong to you. Not legally, not socially, not emotionally, not even mentally. and beneath your calm expression, a truth whispers, "This is not partnership. This is possession." The carriage rattles along the cobblestone street, each bump sending a small shiver through your spine. Outside, the city moves with a practiced rhythm, gentlemen striding with canes, children darting between lampposts, vendors calling out wares beneath the grey sky. But to you, everything feels muted, as though a thick sheet of glass separates you from the world, as though you're watching life happen rather than living it. You smooth your gloves and sit straighter, aware of the driver's occasional glances in the mirror. Even he is watching. Everyone is always watching. The expectation to appear composed hasn't left you for a single moment since breakfast. But today's journey doesn't end at a tea gathering. It ends at something far more uncomfortable, a conversation about divorce, or rather, the impossibility of it, because every Victorian wife, whether happy or unhappy, sooner or later confronts the same question. What happens if the marriage fails? The short, brutal answer? Nothing, because you have no way out. Your breath hitches slightly as the carriage pulls onto a quieter lane lined with tall brick houses and ivy-covered fences. You're not going to the solicitor that would be too scandalous, too desperate, too bold for a proper wife. You're going to Lady Mayfair's estate, the queen of whispered truths, the woman everyone consults when they're too afraid to see a lawyer. When the carriage stops, you take a steadying breath. The footman opens the door. You step out onto the stone path, boots crunching softly against gravel. Lady Mayfair's home towers above you, elegant but imposing, the kind of house that looks like it could swallow secrets whole. A maid leads you inside, through a maze of chandeliers and wallpapered hallways, until you reach a small sitting room. Lady Mayfair waits by the window, a teacup poised delicately between her fingers. She is older, with silver hair pinned in a regal style, and eyes sharp enough to slice through the thickest pretense. "Mrs. Harwood," she says warmly, though her gaze is dissecting you already. "Do sit." You obey, folding your hands neatly in your lap. She takes a slow sip of tea, then sets the cup down with a soft clink. "I hear you've settled into marriage. Adequately. Adequately." A word with 1,000 meanings. You force a slight smile. "I'm doing my best." Lady Mayfair studies you for a long moment. The room feels too warm, too quiet, too heavy. "Let us not pretend," she says at last. Every new bride wonders, at least once, what her options are. Your heart stops. She noticed. Of course she did. Lady Mayfair has the uncanny ability to see the truth beneath any polite smile. I'm not sure what you mean," you whisper. "Oh, my dear," she replies softly. "You wouldn't be the first young wife to find herself overwhelmed, and you won't be the last." You lower your gaze, unsure whether to feel comforted or exposed. Lady Mayfair leans closer. "Tell me plainly, do you feel trapped?" You don't answer. You don't need to. The silence says everything. She sighs, not unkindly. "Let me tell you something important, Mrs. Harwood. Victorian marriage is not a partnership. It's a contract. And if you wish to break it, the law will strangle you." Your stomach churns. A mainstream fact lands like a hammer in your mind. Before 1857, divorce in England required a private act of Parliament. After 1857, it became merely ruinously difficult instead of impossible. Lady Mayfair gestures for the maid to pour tea, then continues. "For a man to divorce a woman, he must prove adultery." She pauses. "For a woman to divorce a man, she must prove adultery and cruelty, or adultery and desertion, or adultery and bigamy. Adultery alone is not enough for you. The law does not trust women with liberty." You grip your teacup tightly. Lady Mayfair's voice lowers to a whisper. "And even if you succeed, even if the courts believe you, you lose everything. Your reputation, your home, your income, your children." A sharp pain stabs through your chest. She continues, her tone hardening. "The law will give them to your husband, without hesitation." Your throat feels tight, your breath shallow. Losing a home is one thing, Losing your dignity, another. But losing your children, your hypothetical children, your future children, is a pain so monstrous it feels like an open wound. Lady Mayfair watches your reaction closely. "This is why most women endure," she murmurs. "Not because they are weak, but because the law leaves them no other choice." You stare at your teacup, unable to speak. A storm swells inside your ribs, fear, anger, disbelief, grief, all tangled together. "You must understand something vital," Lady Mayfair adds gently. "A Victorian wife cannot afford to fall from grace. Society punishes women far more harshly than men." A quirky historical detail flickers into your thoughts. When a Victorian man committed adultery, society called it indiscretion. When a Victorian woman committed adultery, society called it ruin. Lady Mayfair's voice sharpens. "Do not give them a reason to ruin you." You swallow hard. Is there truly no escape? She sighs, her expression softening. There are separations, quiet arrangements. But even then, your husband may control your money, your movements, and your children. The courts rarely side with wives. You feel yourself shrinking, dissolving, disappearing. "What should I do?" you whisper. She studies you for a long, heavy moment. Then she says, "You survive. You learn the rules so well you can bend them without breaking. You protect yourself quietly. You build influence in shadows. And when the world gives you no door, you make a window." A strange flicker of strength stirs in your chest. Lady Mayfair smiles faintly, as though she sees it. "Remember, Mrs. Harwood," she says softly, "Victorian men hold the power, but Victorian women, we hold the secrets." The carriage ride home feels different. The city is the same. Your home is the same. Your husband's power is the same. But you are not the same. For the first time, you understand the true stakes of Victorian womanhood. Not just obedience, not just performance. Survival. Clever, silent, strategic survival. As the carriage rolls toward the house, you don't feel free, not even close, but you feel something new. Awareness. Sharp and dangerous. A weapon that Victorian society never intended you to wield. The carriage wheels crunch softly against the gravel as you return home. Lady Mayfair's words echoing in your mind, like the low toll of a distant church bell. Victorian men hold the power, but Victorian women, we hold the secrets. The phrase lingers, clings, settles into you with a strange, electric clarity. It's not hope exactly. Hope is too gentle, too fragile. What you feel now is sharper. Awareness, awakening, a quiet readiness you never expected to have. The footman opens the door, offering his hand. You step down carefully, your dress brushing the ground like a whisper. The house looms ahead of you, same bricks, same windows, same heavy door, but you see it differently now. It is not simply a home, it is a stage, a battlefield, a cage. And yet, within every cage, there are corners of shadow where rebellion can hide. You walk inside with your chin lifted slightly higher, just a fraction. Enough that no one would call it improper, but enough that you can feel the difference. A pair of maids curtsy as you pass. You nod, evenly, calmly, but their eyes catch something in your expression that wasn't there before. Not confidence, exactly. Not defiance. Something quieter, a flame behind the lace. You ascend the stairs, your hand grazing the banister. Each step feels like the beginning of something, though you still don't know what. Because now comes the strangest, most unexpected part of Victorian marriage. The women who survived it, not by obedience, but by strategy. The women who fought back, quietly, cleverly, persistently. You push open the door to your room and pause. On your vanity sits the bouquet from Mrs. Blackley, the petals slightly wilted. You move it aside, gently but deliberately, and sit before the mirror. Your reflection stares back, tidy hair, calm expression, perfect posture, a proper wife, a respectable woman. But now you know there's a version of you behind the mirror who is not nearly as delicate. Lady Mayfair was right. Victorian wives were expected to bend until they broke, but not all of them did. Some of them learned to bend like steel. After a few minutes, you rise and move to your writing desk. The envelope from your mother lies where you left it earlier. You pull it closer, fingers brushing its edges. You could write another polite, sanitized letter, or you could write something more dangerous, more honest. You open a new sheet of paper, dip your pen, hover, and then, instead of writing your fears or frustrations, both too dangerous to put in ink, you write carefully coded lines. The kind of subtle messages women used to send each other when men were always reading over their shoulders. I am finding my footing. Marriage is instructive. The house is large, but I am learning its corners. I am learning my role. And how to adapt it. Only another woman would understand the subtext. Only a mother would read between those lines and hear what you truly mean. You seal the letter with a quiet exhale. One step. Small, simple, but yours. When you return to the hallway, a soft noise catches your attention. The door to your husband's study is cracked open, and voices drift out. She seems uncertain, a man says, unfamiliar. Possibly a business associate or a distant cousin. She'll settle, your husband replies. They always do. A wife just needs direction. You feel something flare inside you. Not rage, not sorrow. Something steadier, a recognition of the battlefield. This is how he sees you. Someone to be shaped, someone to be managed. But Lady Mayfair's voice returns. You survive by being underestimated. You retreat quietly before they notice. Later, in the afternoon, you walk through the garden. The autumn air is crisp, and the leaves crunch softly beneath your shoes. Here, finally, you feel a moment of solitude, freedom, a small one, but real. You pause beneath an ivy-covered archway, pulling your shawl tighter around your shoulders. This garden was designed long before you arrived. Neatly trimmed hedges, controlled blooms, no room for wildness. But you notice something the gardeners missed. A cluster of violets growing stubbornly through a crack in the stonework. Small, delicate flowers forcing their way through solid ground. You kneel and touch one gently. Victorian wives were taught to be like roses, cultivated, trimmed, admired. But maybe survival belonged to the violets, fragile-looking, but fiercely persistent. You stand again, feeling oddly strengthened by the tiny flowers at your feet. That evening, as you prepare for supper, you choose a dress your husband prefers, but you pin your hair in a style you prefer. A small rebellion, invisible to everyone but you. When you enter the dining room, he glances up. You look lovely, he says. You smile politely. Thank you. He doesn't notice the difference in your hair, or the difference in your eyes, or the growing resolve in your chest. But perhaps that is the point. Dinner is quiet, full of polite conversation. He talks about business. You answer where expected. But you also ask one question, subtle, harmless, disguised as curiosity. And what will happen with the estate once the arrangements are finalized? He looks slightly surprised. Why do you ask? You tilt your head gently. I simply like to understand the world I live in. He nods, reassured. To him, it sounds like feminine curiosity, nothing threatening, nothing sharp. But inside, something has shifted. You aren't accepting ignorance anymore. You're learning, observing, collecting information. Knowledge is a weapon Victorian women wielded, quietly unseen, but powerful. Later that night, you sit by the window with a small lamp, reading a book you weren't technically supposed to borrow from your husband's library, a volume of Mary Wollstonecraft's essays that had been tucked behind rows of dull political treatises. You read slowly, absorbing every line about women's education, autonomy, and agency. Thoughts you were always told were improper now feel like a hidden doorway inside your mind. As the clock strikes 9, you close the book and rest your hand on it thoughtfully. You think of the women history forgot, wives, mothers, widows, who survived marriages far harsher than yours by using wit, intelligence, alliances, letters, influence, manipulation of social rules, subtle charm, and quiet resistance. Women who found freedom not outside the system, but through its cracks. Women who created networks, friendships, and coded conversations across tea tables. Women who supported each other in whispers. Women who shaped their world from the shadows. Victorian men held the public power. Victorian women held the private power. Soft, silent, strategic, and often far more enduring. And slowly, piece by piece, you understand. You are not powerless, not entirely, not anymore. The darkness outside deepens, the house settling into its nighttime hush. You leave the lamp on your nightstand and slip into bed, your heartbeat calmer than it has been in days. Tomorrow, the world will demand your obedience again. It will measure your dress, your posture, your tone, your smile. Your husband will expect silent compliance. Society will expect flawless performance. But tonight here, alone, you allow yourself a quiet, radical truth. You will survive this era not by fitting into it, but by outthinking it. And that is a rebellion no one can see coming. Morning arrives quietly, as if the world itself is tiptoeing into your room. Pale light spills across the floorboards, softening the edges of the furniture and warming the space just enough to remind you that another day has begun. But today feels different. Not lighter, not freer, just clearer. Like the fog inside your mind has finally thinned enough for you to see the shape of your future. Even if the path is still full of shadows, you sit up slowly, pulling the blanket around your shoulders. The house murmurs to life downstairs, servants moving like clockwork, the same predictable rhythm you've grown accustomed to. For the first time, though, you listen with new ears. Every footstep, every rustle of fabric, every faint clink of silverware carries a meaning. This house is not just a cage, it is a system, and systems can be understood, navigated, influenced. You rise and move to the window, hands braced against the cold glass. Outside, the street stretches quietly beneath a thin veil of mist. A baker's boy runs past with a basket of fresh loaves. A seamstress opens her shutters. A lamplighter extinguishes the last of the street lamps. All living lives with more freedom than yours, yet none of them hold the peculiar, hidden power Victorian wives cultivated in silence. That is something you've only recently begun to grasp. You whisper softly to your reflection, though the glass offers no reply. What will my Victorian future be? The question hangs in the air like unspoken prophecy. You dress slowly, choosing a gown with soft ivory folds, respectable, elegant, but comfortable enough to move in freely. Today, you allow yourself just one more rebellion. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for your lungs to expand. In the mirror, you catch your own eye and see something new, not strength exactly, but resolve. And resolve can be far more powerful. A maid enters quietly to help with your hair. As she works, she glances at your reflection in the mirror. You look brighter today, ma'am. You offer a small smile. Do I? Yes, she replies softly, like someone who found something they'd lost. You don't answer, but the words settle in your chest. Perhaps you did lose something, and perhaps you are beginning to reclaim it. Downstairs, the morning room is warm and bright, sunlight catching the framed paintings and turning them golden. You sit with your tea, listening to the distant clink of china as servants prepare the dining room. Your husband enters soon after, dressed smartly, reading a folded newspaper. He greets you politely and takes his seat. The two of you exchange routine pleasantries, the weather, his business, afternoon engagements. But beneath the familiar script, you sense something subtle changing. He doesn't notice that you're studying his words, his gestures, his tone, the spaces between his sentences. You are learning the landscape of his personality, mapping the contours of his habits the way Victorian wives before you did, not out of devotion, but out of necessity. Knowledge is your shield now, and he does not yet realize you're carrying it. After he finishes his coffee, he stands and adjusts his coat. Lady Harwood, he he says gently, a rare softness in his voice. "I trust your day will pass pleasantly." "It will," you reply, your tone steady. "I have much to tend to." He nods, reassured by what he doesn't know. Perhaps by the calm way you sit. Perhaps by the pleasant cadence of your voice. Perhaps by the illusion of obedience you've perfected. Before leaving, he pauses, as though searching for the proper words. "You're adjusting well," he says. "I'm glad of it." You bow your head slightly. "Thank you." But inside, you hear Lady Mayfair's voice whispering again. You survive by being underestimated. He leaves, and the house exhales. So do you. You spend the late morning walking through the garden, gloves brushing against the tops of lavender bushes, skirt whispering across stone paths. There's something grounding about the outdoors, a reminder that the world is larger than parlours, ledgers, and curated smiles. As you walk, you reflect on the women who came before you, the ones who shaped their lives within the constraints of Victorian society. Some learned influence through charity circles. Some cultivated social alliances. Some managed households with the precision of generals. Some carved out quiet intellectual lives in libraries and salons. Some wrote letters that held entire rebellions between the lines. Some never escaped the system, yet still found ways to bend it. You pause beneath the arch of climbing roses, remembering the violets blooming defiantly from cracked stone. Those stubborn little flowers didn't care about rules. They simply grew where they could. Maybe that is all Victorian women were ever trying to do. By afternoon, you return indoors and take a seat at your writing desk. A stack of household papers awaits your review. Account books, menus, invitations, schedules, bills. Tasks that once felt suffocating now feel like tiny opportunities. You open the ledger and scan the entries. A small notation catches your eye. A charity donation your husband agreed to, but clearly signed without reading the details. You make a mental note. The charity is run by Mrs. Penbury, a notoriously influential woman whose gatherings attract the region's most respected wives. If you attend her next event, you could quietly gain access to a new social circle, not for vanity, for leverage. Victorian society may be brutal, but social webs have power. Conversations overheard, rumors intercepted, alliances formed. You begin to understand why women in this era were simultaneously dismissed and feared. They traded influence in places men didn't even think to look. You fold the ledger neatly and tuck it away. This is your new battlefield. These are your tools. Later in the day, you move through the house with newfound presence. You speak to the cook about dinner preparations, noting which dishes your husband prefers and which gatherings might require a stronger display of domestic excellence. You speak to the butler about visiting hours. You comfort a maid who burned her finger, offering her the kind of kindness that wouldn't fit in your role, but does fit in your heart. And all the while, the pieces click quietly into place, the way the household runs, the way the neighborhood watches, the way your husband moves, the way society breathes. You are learning your world. And when a woman knows her world, she is no longer lost within it. That evening, you retire early to your room. The maid helps you remove your gown and unlace your stays, and when she leaves, you sit at the edge of your bed, feeling the quiet settle over your shoulders like a soft shawl. You take up your journal, one you keep hidden behind a loose floorboard beneath your wardrobe, and write your thoughts in careful, controlled strokes. I am beginning to see the shape of my life. It is not freedom. Not yet. But it is not nothing. I am finding small ways to exist inside all this expectation. I am finding small ways to remain myself. I am finding corners of power they do not see. You stare at the words, heart trembling but steady. Victorian marriage may be brutal. It may be suffocating. It may be a stage where your role was assigned before you were even born. But somehow, in the quiet spaces between duty and expectation, something else grows. Something delicate, defiant, and deeply human. Your Victorian future is not written yet. It will not be easy. It may not be kind. but it will be yours, piece by piece, corner by corner, whisper by whisper. You close the journal, hide it away, and slip beneath the covers. Tomorrow, you will rise again to face a world that demands perfection. But tonight, you rest as the most dangerous thing a Victorian wife can be, a woman who sees clearly.